Work.
All right, so I'd like to go ahead and call today's meeting to order, and it is 5:31. Before we begin, I'd like to welcome everyone. Thank you for being here, and Krista, who is coming in long distance from San Francisco. So we need to make a motion to allow Krista to participate in the budget meeting. And so roll call for this too. All right, so we will, because Krista is on Zoom, we need to do all the voting by roll call. So
Robney, yes.
And yes.
Debbie,
Okay.
yes.
Steve, yes.
Please.
Rich, yes.
Dawn, yeah.
Vicky, yes.
I'm going to abstain from voting for myself.
You're in, Krista. Thank you.
Krista, can you hear us okay? Is the sound good?
I can mostly, yeah. Thank you for checking.
Now.
Can I swear in Charlotte?
Steve, could you pass Charlie?
Yes.
Tag down. Thank you.
Do you solemnly and sincerely swear that you will faithfully and impartially discharge and perform all the duties incumbent upon you as a budget committee member for a term of 3 years according to the best of your abilities, agreeably to the rules and regulations of the Constitution and the laws of the state of New Hampshire, so help you God?
I do.
And if you could sign here.
Wonderful.
You like a pen?
All right.
Here you go, Charlie.
Thank you. Just here?
Yeah, just that one. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Nina. Would you please stand before we start and we'll say the pledge. Rich, would you like to start us?
Allegiance to the flag
Of the United States of America
and to the republic
for which it stands, one nation,
under God,
indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Sorry. Where were you? This year, what you get in the-
Bye.
Just go back.
Yeah.
Just kidding.
I'm so excited you're coming.
Me too. And
So-
I got my,
They're so back.
I got my-
All right, so just to confirm, even though Krista and I have
That's exciting.
communicated through email, but I would just like to confirm, Krista, if you would like me to run the meeting in person.
Yes, Debbie, that was my intent. I think it will just flow smoother since you're there in person to move us along the agenda. But I'm happy I will chime in as needed, if that
Thank-
works.
Thank you,
so
Krista.
this is all over. the-
All right, so we have, I would like to introduce a motion to approve the April 10th minutes. The minutes were sent around to everyone. Is there any discussion or corrections for the minutes?
I just wanted to say, I thought that you did a really nice job with the minutes.
Which was Beverly.
Oh, Beverly did a nice job.
That's good.
With that, I'll move, we approve the very nice public meeting in April 10th.
All right, so it will be by roll call.
I'm going to abstain as I was absent for the meeting.
Do we need yes, a second, please?
Oh, I second that we approve the minutes
Thank you.
from April.
Thank you. All right, roll call.
I abstain.
Yes.
Debbie, yes.
Abstain.
Yes.
Yes.
Abstain as well.
Yes.
Yes, was just barely made it.
So the minutes are passed. Next on our agenda, oh, Krista, did you vote?
I approve.
Thank you. Next on the agenda is to review and discuss the budget metrics and indicators that could be utilized to set targets for overall budget increases for the 2025 budget process. there any discussion?
I think you gotta wait till Mark gets here to, because he was supposed to bring in a bunch of information, so we need to table that for right now and move on.
I think I've got a bunch of information from the
do.
school side. If you'd like to, could go over that. And then when Mark gets here, we could continue with his, if that's okay with folks.
That's okay with me. I do have Mark's spreadsheet, but as long as he's planning, do we know that he's like on his way? He's coming?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Oh, great.
Timing.
His timing is impeccable.
So Margaret, please settle in and take a deep breath, but we were just ready to, we approved the minutes. And we were ready to start on the third item on the agenda to review and discuss the budget metrics and indicators that from the lenses.
Very good.
Maybe just skip the next one. We're trying to come up with.
All right.
how we should approach next.
All right, so, all right, Mark has requested that we move on to the next item and we'll come back to the third.
What frame?
Fourth is the town budget update. Kendra?
You would all receive the summary revenue and expense, sheets and for the, first 4 months actually of the years that we're on a calendar year basis. In terms of, revenues, there's timing. Other than that, pretty much things are in line. The one good one to point out is interest on investments is, looks like it's gonna run, considerably higher than, budgeted. So there's really nothing, else I had to point out on the, revenue side. On the expense side, similarly, things are running comparable to budget. Some things are timing differences, particularly ones with the state where they don't pay us till the end of the year. One good thing to point out is we received the oil bid rate for starting July 1.
Yes.
And it's 309, so it's considerably below what we anticipated in the budget.
It's actually 284.
280.
It was 309
Oh.
last year.
Oh, thank you for that.
And we should thank Michelle at the school, Michelle Clark, who we go out to bid with the school, and she did all the legwork on this.
So, with that abbreviated report, if there are any questions.
Just seems like continuing drama with the transfer station. Where are we kind of at as far as like everything that was voted on and moving forward with?
We've had about 12 meetings recently on it.
Understood.
And we're having another one with the Webster Select Board next Monday night. And then 3 weeks after that, we're having another public session. Everything is preliminary, nothing's been decided, but it looks like we're gonna be requiring stickers from anybody who's eligible to use the station from Hopkinton and Webster, because it was apparently some individuals from Concord taking advantage of it. At this point, the thought is potentially the price of green bags is going to more or less double. The waiver that had been granted during the pandemic for one of the haulers to bring in non-green bags of residential is going to be rescinded. The actual other rates are, still up in the air somewhat because of Webster. We have to deal with Webster, and somehow there's going to have to be some enforcement of green bags. And like I want to stress, everything is still up in the air.
Okay. So as far as tipping fees, we're at least covering what we're paying with the goal of eventually making a little more.
The tipping fees is one of the things that we're going to agree on.
So
with
that's
Webster, and the range we're preliminary looking at would more than cover our immediate costs.
Okay.
Did I misstate anything, Neil?
Yep.
That's unusual. Okay, any other questions?
Yes. So I will move to accept.
Second.
Second. All right. So we're roll calling because Krista's there.
I don't think you necessarily have to vote
don't
to
have to
accept a
vote.
re, it's just an update.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you for the update, Ken.
Yeah.
All right, so Mark, would you like us to continue or are you ready? to
Neil,
move on?
is it possible to email you something that you can then project for the? commission?
Throw it on a stick.
Yeah, I'm trying, so I can't seem to get the, to,
I also did send you the one that I had added the municipal cost index to.
the link. Yeah, I see that. Just, I just, I can't project off my computer, so I need to save it. Let me see if this works. Otherwise,
Okay,
maybe carry
We'll-
on to the next
yes,
item.
we'll carry on.
We'll eventually get
let
there.
me know when you're ready. All right, so next in line, we have our Kentucky Village Precinct Financial Update. Don.
Okay, pass these out to you folks. I think I was coming up so quick. Lots happening at the precinct right now. We've got a new operator there, and it's a company, so they have great experience throughout the state of running operations like we have and bigger. And we're finding out that we're sort of like where a school was a few years ago, where you're getting a heck of a good education, but the facilities were needing a lot of help. And with the same thing I could summarize with the precinct, you're still getting absolute good quality water, but we're finding out that we have a lot of things that need to be updated. Some of the pumps and valves and all that are totally outdated, and there's no backup and there's no replacement, so we're gonna have to go to whole new systems and whole new setups. And that's gonna be extensive and it's gonna take quite a while to do. In the meantime, of course, we haven't received, revenues in from the town or the warrants. From the taxes, so we basically run out of $100,000 worth of cash that we had on hand to pay the everyday expenses. Plus, we've had expenses that we had to reimburse the contractors who were doing the studies that are funded by the the state government. So when they say you got $100,000 worth of grant money, you spend some of that, and that's the contractors have got to be paid before the state reimburses. So we got caught up with that situation also. So the remedy to our cash situation is to go into our line of credit and take out a couple $100,000 out of that reserve fund, which has almost 2 million in it. So that'll get us through a lot of the updates that we have that were probably going to take place this year. So we didn't want to keep going back and forth to that. So the suggestion was just, take that money and put it in there. So that's sort of where we are, but it's going to be quite a process. But again, the quality of water is there. It's just that we need to update almost everything that's there. Any questions?
Don, you mentioned 2 million and I wasn't sure what you were talking about.
That's in our capital reserve fund. We're putting $250,000 in there for the last few years, and it's now up to that amount. And we always knew, 10 years, 15 years ago, that we were gonna have to probably put in a whole new system up on Bound Tree, which is tank and all of that stuff. And that's many more million now, of course, with inflation and all the new requirements. So this is just to get the Band-Aids off and get real fixes in, which have been happening for the last few years.
John, my question would be, do you just start moving forward with this? Does this need to be a public hearing? How do we notify the
No,
public?
The funds were set up so that the commissioners could get into those dollars without any public hearing, no meetings or any. Good question.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Any concept or broad outline of what the rates will look like, water rates will look like?
No, that's still being studied and still trying to get the evaluation for that, but the rates will definitely be going.
I guess I should dig a well then.
You should tap into the river.
Do you anticipate using your water system operator for the upgrades, or is that something that needs to be bid out?
The control of it all will be done by them. And also a lot of the work will be done by them. I don't know, but I don't anticipate any of the items. Well, it's not true. So some of the items will be done by contract, but it'll be controlled by the
Okay.
operator.
Got it,
And they have their own staff but they can't do it all.
right.
Any other?
further discussion for Dawn? Or questions? Thank you, Dawn. All right, next we have Victoria Leeds for the Hopkinton Village Precinct Financial.
Hey, thank you.
Would you take one and pass it down? You've got two statements here. The first is the precinct and the second is the water department. And similar to Ken and John's reports on page 1, the reason why we're in the negative is because we're waiting for our transfers from the amount to be raised by taxes. Whereas on the water department, they bill quarterly for the water, so they've already been making money so far this year. So there's nothing off budget as far as I can tell, but I don't have anything interesting to report.
I'm sure that will come along soon enough. Any further discussion for Vicky? Thank you. All right, so next we have Rob, Hopkinton School District Financial Update.
Yep, so you've got the monthly financial statement for March. April will come out at our next meeting, which is next week. On page 2, just a couple of things to highlight, I suppose. Right now, our anticipated fund balance is right where we think it should be at 493. That will probably rise a little bit in the coming month and a half as we close out the books on some POs and Michelle transfers some things over. Food service, which has always been sort of a bailiwick, is actually in pretty good shape. I think we mentioned before that for some reason during COVID, well, the reason was kids got free breakfast and lunch, and apparently they started keeping that practice. So our revenues are up pretty significantly over past years. So the funding is much better. And then down at the bottom, you've got our trust fund balances in Article 10. So far, in terms of hiring, things have been going pretty well. So, the sweet spot for us is right around 7 years of experience, and that saves us money in the long haul. Last year, our savings on hires was about $150,000. Shut this thing up. And we think we're in a pretty good place. So hiring is going, I would say it's almost complete, which is well ahead. And part of that is the schools really reaching out, going to job fairs, et cetera. On the finance side, not a whole lot. We have a finance committee meeting on Monday. We're continuing to talk about moving some of our balance, kind of like the town, to short-term CDs. So we've had a discussion with TD Bank, we've had a discussion with the treasurer, and now we're going to have that one more discussion and decide whether or not we want to go that route. And the hiccup is really for those 2 months out of the year where balances fall pretty low because spending is high the end of June and then again in December. But we're hoping we're able to do that. And we started at the discussion at putting $500,000 with 30-day CDs are right now about 5%. So if we were able to do that, we'd be netting about $25,000-$30,000. So I think the important thing is that we're trying, to claw some revenue everywhere we possibly can, but ultimately that will be the treasurer's decision. So we'll see where that goes. Yeah. And happy to answer any questions.
Yeah. I couldn't get it.
I don't want to feel like we're not getting it. That nationally, hearing that, there's an awful lot of teacher layoffs nationwide. Just because there's not getting funding. So are we finding that if we're looking for teachers, there's a bigger, population to choose from?
So two things I think have happened. One, we were able to get out in front and get early. So we were interviewing people as early as right after school district meeting in March and in early April. So lots of candidates that were available or thinking about looking for work, i.e. Pembroke, or they've laid off a whole bunch of teachers. So that gave us, our numbers were higher in terms of the number of applicants, which is always good to have a larger applicant pool to draw from. And again, recruiting from Keene and Plymouth has gone well. So we always want to try and hire good young guns if you can. And sometimes you have to hire people with more experience just because of the nature of the work that they do. So we're in a good place. We're in a better place than a lot of school districts are.
Thank you.
Rob, can you update us on 2 suits?
Holding pattern at this point. It's really no different from where we were. We're waiting. The state has, I gotta make sure I get this right. The state has appealed that decision by the judge that said you're gonna have to pay $7,400 some dollars per student. So when that appeal process gets done, we'll know where we're at, but it's probably going to be summer at least before that happens. There was some movement in the state legislature to increase the base rate for aid. It wasn't a lot, but it was, $300 or $400. There was also an increase to special ed funding. Again, not a lot. There was one bill that went forward that said the state should be responsible for special ed funding across the board. That died, but I think the conversations are being had. So that's a positive thing, and hopefully we can keep that process going. Again, I would track, if you're interested in the education piece, the New Hampshire Fair Funding Foundation. They're doing great work in their outreach, tracking bills, as well as the New Hampshire School Board Association. So
Did the judge's decision have anything to do with how the state was supposed to fund that?
no,
That'll be up to the state to figure it out.
that would be up to the state to figure that out.
Good luck.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any further questions, for Rob? Thank you, Rob.
You're welcome.
All right, well, Mark, how would you like to proceed on this?
Well, I think I should first say, this isn't my issue.
Right, you're right.
I think
You're right.
I haven't,
Yeah.
I'm just one member of the committee.
That's right.
Some items.
We just thought it might be best to
Sure.
wait for you.
So Rob and Chris and I did an awesome job of not, waiting until the very last minute and not exactly, preparing for this. So,
Okay,
I guess with that said, like
I've got some stuff for the school side to talk about. So
Rob prepared.
all right.
Yeah.
It just didn't, you just didn't actually share that with Krista and I in advance. So I don't know what you prepared, Rob.
Yeah.
Um, maybe you want to start.
So, yeah, so I'm just going to start. First, I apologize for not being at the last meeting. It was one of those, you guys really didn't want me in your presence, but I did listen to the meeting after, and certainly was a robust discussion about targeting budgets in term. My understanding is, should the budget committee set a target goal for both the town and the school at some X% based on some measure of inflation? And I certainly appreciate the spirit of that. And I think as I sort of go through what I have for the school and some different measures, I'll come back to maybe a different way of approaching it in terms of, are we targeting or are we asking for validation? Because I think those are two very, very different things. I guess I'm going there now. My short sense here is that in municipalities and states where they set target rates, things can go sideways very quickly as inflation perhaps accelerates, and we have spikes. So, and for us particularly, like I can find inflation measures for salaries and benefits, which I'll share in a minute. There is no inflation measure for special education, which, as you know, is a huge percentage of our costs. And, we see upticks all the time when families move in or leave, or children get placed in a new setting. So that can be difficult. So I guess at the forefront of this, I would ask the committee to consider whether or not a more appropriate way to deal with the inflation markers is to say, can you validate what you're doing based on some measures of inflation that are connected to what you do? So for the schools, the employment cost index for elementary and secondary education, and see where we're at. So why don't I go to the presentation, and you also all have it on your laptops, might be easier to see there. And we can kind of walk through it. If this starts to sound like a high school economics teacher, I apologize, but old habits die hard. So the first slide, what I did here, and Michelle and I put together, this is the data from the DOE 25 over the last 25 years by budget component. So first across the top, some are self-explanatory: salaries, benefits, purchase services, just for your reminder from the budget bulletin, includes things like professional services. So this is any contracted special education that we might have, curriculum development, conventions, contracted evaluation services, testing, things of that nature. Property services, those are all of the mechanicals that we might have, and then transportation, liability, et cetera. And then supplies is supplies, as you would think about. Property is a reference to new equipment, replacement equipment, additional furniture, replaced furniture, and new vehicles. And I'll talk about that one specifically. And then other is dues, fees, bond principal, bond interest, fund transfers that might happen.
Is this the slide you're on?
Yes, that's the slide I'm on. So when we look at the salaries category, you get the 10 years, we're 19.14% increase, so year-over-year change of 1.91. And then in the benefits, where we know we've taken it on the chin the last 3 years, we're at 53 for a total of 5.38. When you combine those, we're at 2.93% year over year. And that's kind of the way I like to think about inflation markers, not, it's kind of like looking at your returns on your investments, right? So we want to look at the average. So I think we're doing better than many people would suggest that we are when we look at our budgets in a percentage terms. The purchase services, so this is a little bit higher, 7.63%. And I didn't create a slide for this, but I did create some notes, and I asked Michelle to do some work here. So of that number, about 50% of that is special ed over the last 5 years. So most of our increase is there. And then the other 25 to 30% is transportation. So just about 80% of these three categories is that special ed and transportation marker. So the transportation is not only our in-town service, but all of those transportation services we provide to students that might be on the seacoast, wherever they might happen to be. So that's fairly high. And this is the one that I struggle with when we talk about setting a target inflation marker, because there is no target inflation marker. Like, we can get one for transportation perhaps, but dialing that into public education, transportation, and private service, which is really what it is really hard to do. Supplies number, again, right about where you would expect it to be, 4.1%. The property is a little bit skewed. So if you go through year by year there, you can see it sort of bumps around, right? We're at 197, 270, 172, then it kicks up to 570, 22, 23 was 543. My question to Michelle is, what the heck is going on here? So to give you an example of the big jump from 251 to 543, we had that outsized fund balance as a sort of a hangover from COVID. And projects that got done with some of that was the completion of district-wide carpeting, new oil boiler, I can't remember at which school, the SAU renovation, which was 131,000. So the total of things that were paid for there was 312. So that was all fund balance spending. It gets kicked into that category. So it sort of like jumps it up, and it'll come back down again this year because we're not going to have that liberty there. And then the other category was 9.9%. So this just, I think, shows us the trends in the school district, which is helpful. It's helpful for me anyway. The next slide, and I don't know how it's going to project up there. It's pretty good. So the indicators that I looked at were the employment cost index at the top. And again, you can see for state and local government workers in elementary and secondary education. So that's us. That's the cleanest inflation indicator.
You might want to talk closer to your microphone.
Oh, sorry.
Quite a ways away.
That's the cleanest indicator that we have for education. And that also includes, you know, when the ECI includes all of your benefits. So you've got your healthcare in there, you've got your required things like FICA and Social Security, et cetera. So it's a really good marker to use. After that, I'm going to slide over here so I can look at the screen and use the speaker. The employment cost index, this is total compensation, all civilians. So this is, generally speaking, the workers in the US. So the comparison, that's your red line. So we're the green, the red is a little bit higher. And I would imagine that's because wages tend to be a little bit higher in many segments. And then I pulled two different inflation indicators. So CPI is your purple line, and then PCE is your blue line. And they tend to run together pretty well. And you can see that PCE skyrocketed post-COVID, and there were some reasons for that when we look at the splits. Can you put the next slide up there? So this one, I was just thinking about the town. So again, the school, the education line is the green. The yellow line is state and local government, all workers. I didn't do a deep exploration to see how well this fit, but it seemed like as I was looking at the different subcategories, this would be the best one perhaps for the town to consider, but that's somebody else's ballywick. Then again, we have the employment cost index, that red line, so just above that, and then CPI and PCE. So, you know, we sort of track the employment cost index pretty well. And again, that is 75, 80% of our budget. So, you know, when we talk about the meat in our budget, this is where it is. And just for clarification, so when you use this Fred system, you can plug in the ways that you want it to show. So I did this year to year changes percent. Okay, so this is showing the percent change year to year. And there's lots of different ways to do that, but this showed me the smoothest lines. So we're right about at that 5% right now on this chart in terms of national data. And, you know, again, our 10-year average is 3. I think our average this year was a little closer to 4%. So we can go to the next one, Neil. So this one, I just wanted to have this conversation because I know that we've talked about differences in what to use. So CPI is what everybody talks about on the left, and personal consumption expenditures on the right, again, is the one that the Federal Reserve tracks in terms of when they're doing their analysis for what interest rates should be. And the big differences for me are two things. Well, three things actually. So you can see the weights are incredibly different. So let's talk about the biggest dinosaur in the room, which is medical care. So over on the CPI side, you're at 8.8% of their basket of goods is medical care. But their medical care is only, I'm going to get my notes so I don't lead you astray. In CPI, they only track out-of-pocket household expenses, copays, and deductibles. That's what they're tracking. That's crazy town. Sorry. In the PCE, it's 22% is accounted to medical. And what they track, this makes more sense to me, is all medical goods and services produced or given by employers. So what we provide to our workers, as well as Medicare and Medicaid. Well, that seems like a lot more logical as to the real expense of medical and the percentage being much higher, which I think is more appropriate to what we look at in terms of, our costs as a school district or as a town. The other thing to think about in terms of PCE is that it also accounts for substitute goods where CPI doesn't. So CPI is just this big giant 60,000 units of goods in this giant basket, and they literally go out and check the prices every month. In the PCE, they look at, well, guess what? Steak at the market basket last weekend was $13.99 a pound. Guess what I didn't buy? I didn't buy a lot of steak. I bought more chicken. PCE tracks substitute goods and their impact on the economy. So it's going to account for those things. CPI does not change its market basket of goods on that type of situation. So it's way, way off in terms of the lag and what's going on. So I don't know if that was helpful or not helpful, but this is why I think the PCE is a much better indicator for us to talk about because of the way it tracks, particularly medical expenses in terms of where it's at. And we can look at that subcomponent of that to see where it is to use in our, to sort of back up what we're doing with the schools. So I guess to sort of go back to my initial premise and go back to slide 1, please, Neil, is that I would think that as we're building our budgets, as we did, I hope we did this last year, is to say, this is what the subcomponent category costs were. This is why they were there, and that they're in line with reality. And I think that these graphs show that we are very much in line with reality, certainly in salaries and benefits again. My concern is setting a target in what happens in special education. And I think we also need to remember that it's not just a student comes in and it bumps us. A very, very large portion of our employees work in special education, either special education teachers or instructional assistants. It's almost 25% of that pool. So this is a big part of what we do. So I think I've said a lot, and I'll be quiet and let people talk and answer questions if anybody has questions.
What would you guess this next year's rate will be? I mean, you got a 10-year average there of 3.58, or is it 5.6?
Say that again.
What do you think that, in your idea of managing the school, where would you like to see, or where do you think you'll see relative to the 3.58 number?
I think a large part of that will have to do with what happens with health insurance and whether or not what's that term you told me about? The mod is, and if we're still at 140, or heaven forbid, if we go above that, we're going to get slaughtered again. So that will be a piece of the puzzle that we're going to have to deal with. I do think that the hiring practices will help us on the other end. The other, it won't impact next year's, well, it will actually impact next year's budget. We're in contract negotiation, opens up with the HEA for starting 24-25. So that's, where is that going to go in terms of the whole process and salary increases and what we do with healthcare in that contract. So I can tell you that as somebody who's negotiated on the other side of the table, I would always think about the impact on the tax rate and the viability when we were doing those things. Nobody wants to pass a contract that's going to get voted down at school district meeting. That, and if you're shooting for here and you can only pass there, then you're a fool to shoot for there, right? And I don't know the nature of how this next negotiation will be. I'm going to guess it's going to be as amicable as it usually is, but we have some big challenges to meet. So, yeah.
Next question, that doesn't directly relate to what we're doing here, but why was a significant difference in the housing between the PCE and the CPI? As it was like double at least.
Yeah.
More impacted in the.
Go back to that. I didn't look at that one, Don, but I seem to recall, yeah, so 42% in CPI and a much smaller portion in PCE. And I think that, and I'm gonna go do my homework now that you've asked me, because that wasn't a large question for me because we don't buy a lot of housing as a school district, but it had to do with rental properties versus people acquiring mortgages and how they fracture that out. But I will do that homework for you.
No, it's just curious.
Yeah.
We're doing so much effort here to figure out what housing we should add to the town. I don't know whether this would relate to that or not, but it's certainly a huge issue.
I think essentially in the personal consumption expenditures piece, they feel that PCI or CPI is overstating its significance in people's budgets.
Thank you
Look
for
at-
doing all this. This is impressive and it's very informative.
If you look at
Okay.
data on affordable and workforce housing and the percent of income that's spent on that for rentals, that 22% is much closer to a national average than the 42%.
You know, in term, I have to, the woman that came and spoke to us last December, Catherine Heck, I had asked her for some guidance here and she sent a very long response with some helpful information. And, you know, she talked about, you know, don't forget about revenue and other variables. And she did cite, and I probably need to reach back out to her, an education cost index. And I've searched high and low, and what I've found isn't very helpful to us. I think what she's talking about is an index that talks about education costs on a per capita basis by state. So New Hampshire is pretty high, relatively low per capita, but we still have a fair number of schools. And, you know, one would argue if you were going to create school districts, it's probably as not terrific. You know, people did it in a very territorial way over time. But then you look at places like the Deep South and Idaho, where their per capita costs are very low. So more teachers or fewer teachers, more kids, right? So it wasn't really good for tracking inflation. It was more a good way of looking at cost of education. So interesting to look at and to think about states where you might want to live or not live if you have children, but not so helpful in terms of planning your budget. But I am gonna, I don't, you know, it's free help, so I didn't want to like hound her too much, but I will ask her to send me a direct link because maybe I'm just missing it. Canada apparently has an education cost index, but we don't live in Canada. And they have socialized medicine and other crazy thoughts like that, so.
Does anyone else?
We got a few. So Rob, thank you. That was extremely informative. I learned a lot. Great. It's like a class, it's like a little mini class on school economics. So there's two separate questions, as you said at the beginning, and I would suggest that both are relevant for the budget committee. One is this issue of, you know, really trying to hold, which I think we already do informally, but we can do it with a little more rigor. Ask both the school and the town to be able to, you know, validate their budgets based on relevant indices. And I think you presented some that are, and I'm convinced that PCE is better than CPI and that there's some specific indices for the town and the school that would be really useful benchmarks.
Can I
Um,
just, can I
yeah.
add something there, Mark? I don't mean to interrupt your flow at all, but I did actually get from Catherine at the Municipal Association that there's a municipal cost index. And I added it to your spreadsheet.
The MCI, yeah, thanks. And unfortunately, I couldn't quite figure out. I couldn't make the love connection with Neil on on your version, Krista, but we'll get that to everybody afterwards. But yeah, so I mean, I think that's going to be really useful for us. I also think this question of like, it's about setting targets. I hear you. Why I think that whether it's CPI or PCE, let's just say personal consumption index for tonight's purposes. There's a lot of value to that from the budget committee standpoint, because that reflects people's ability to pay, in my mind. You know, it is a reflection of the pressure, the pricing and cost of living pressure on people in our town. And so there are two different questions. One is, can the town and the school rationalize their budgets? They're not out of whack with, with overall, costs in their sector. But that's a different question than how are people in our town faring with their ability to actually pay, even if those budgets are reasonable, rationalized indices, because of what it's costing them to live in general and to live in our town. And I guess as a budget committee, I feel like we have a responsibility to consider both of those. The question of whether to set targets, which, as you pointed out, has some potentially negative consequences to it. To me, that's more tied to what we have heard from a growing number of people in town, which is, I can't afford to live here anymore. And so when you set a target, I'm not advocating that we do this. I'm just talking about the why in my mind. What you force, for better or worse, is, potentially some hard choices. We want to make sure we are living up to our values around the special, ensuring educational opportunity for all students, regardless of their individual needs and capabilities. To do that and adhere to a certain budget growth might require some more difficult choices in other areas of the budget. It might lead to some different kinds of negotiations around contracts. It's just a different question, I think, that we're tackling if we go down that road. And I think we should talk about both of them.
So I agree they are definitely two different questions, and my teacher hat in economics always used to start with a statement that good economics is bad politics and good politics is bad economics, or can be bad economics. So, whether or not any inflation indicator tells us about people's ability to pay, I think it tells us about pressure on their income, but I don't think it tells us about their ability to pay. So, and again, as I was looking at how the town of Hopkinton, lack of a better word, abates taxes for people below certain income levels and for the elderly, I believe, and seems to be a trend in the state of New Hampshire, makes no sense to me. Because again, it doesn't tell me what their effective tax rate is. So without that measure, I have no idea if you're upset because your taxes are going up, or you're upset, as you should be, because it's now double digits and the first digit starts with a 2 of your income. That's, to me, the conversation. If we truly want to help people in the town of Hopkinton afford to stay here, is a conversation that should be had. So in other words, if we're going to offset your taxes, it should be based on what percentage of your income are you paying in property tax. And if that percentage is greater than 20%, just choosing a number, then your abatement should be the difference. That is based on the ability to pay, not just some, again, number that we say is large or not large. So and that's a different question, right? It's a whole different scheme. But if we're talking about equity, paying taxes in the state of New Hampshire, I was thinking about the governor about a month and a half ago who was very proud that we are one of states with the least tax burden, 5 lowest states in the country. Well, Ken, do you want to preach that one at your next town meeting? I don't want to preach that at school district meeting. Well, we have we pay our burdens through our property taxes at the local level. So if we do acquire other things, perhaps we're just going to redistribute that and be paying the same amount of taxes, just to different folks. These are very large issues that we're dealing with. I would love to see the town have a conversation about if we truly think we're, as we should be, concerned about people that are retired, their incomes are flat and their property values are going high. How can we actually moderate for that? Because a $500 tax break is not going to do it. Let's just be serious. That's, if you got $10,000 in taxes and your SSI and your small retirement is at 60 grand, you're still in the hopper. So anyway, that was a long soliloquy. Thank you for entertaining it.
Well said.
Do you know of any situations in any towns in any states that where you do have that threshold of the ability to pay? Obviously, that abatement has got to be paid by the other taxpayers. Is there anybody that's doing it?
I've researched that for years, Don, and the answer is no.
We
I
don't have
can't
the
find
ability to do that here.
Because to
We're
do
not,
that,
we're not legislatively, like, we don't have the statutory authority to do that. So that would be great. But that's not within our ability as a budget committee or as a town right now.
because to do that, you've got to get in everybody's business, right? Everybody's got to provide their financial data, and that's a whole nother bureaucracy to just do that. It would be a nice way to do it perhaps, but
But we do that every year through the income tax that we pay. Those numbers are readily available. It's just a matter of people. And I know I'm talking like wishfully here, but it is wishful that if we truly want to have fair taxes, that's the way to do it. Fair property taxes, anyway.
We have to live with the system we
I
have. We're not changed.
I completely understand that is the current system. I don't think that means that always has to be the system, and that we could all lobby our legislatures to consider changes. I know in New Hampshire, it'd be like moving granite,
But
but
Rob, I think Ken is suggesting now we have to live with it. We have to operate within it right
Yeah.
now. That's what we have to do.
yeah, I agree.
Question. First of all, thank you very much for this presentation, and you really got some of my gears spinning, thinking in different directions I haven't before. Looking at your numbers here and what you just in your overview have stated that the special ed has really increased. It's 25% of our employees, I think you said, and 50% of our cost increases over the last 10 years.
Yeah, let me,
The first spreadsheet.
right. So the subcomponent numbers, and I was going to share this with you guys, but then it is so small and I couldn't make the font bigger without driving myself crazy. So we've been bopping right around as a percentage there in terms of the purchase services piece in the last 5 years, between 1,073,000 to 1,264,000 of that number, purchase services for special ed. So it's high.
So when Steve and I were in school back in the 80s, special ed was a very small percentage of the employees.
Mhm.
And now it's up to 25%. Arguably, the education that we had in the high school in the 1980s was good. We did a good job educating our kids. I'm sure we could have done better. Just the thought that's forming in my head, have we overreached on the number of employees that we've hired for special ed? I realize there's laws and there's rules and there's regulations, but is this an area that we could look at to find efficiencies in special ed? And specifically, Pembroke, with the huge cuts that they've had, can we look at them as as a model as what could be done to cut and still stay within the legal frameworks.
We'll
And
see if they
still-
stay within the legal frameworks and you see, I mean, I don't know what Pembroke's going to do and where they cut their staff. But, you know, I also, you know, I went to high school in the late 70s. I remember what it was like. Special ed did not really exist. And, you know, 1994 and special ed law changed everything to the good. I mean, I've spent a long time of my career. My first 6 years of my career was at a school for kids with learning disabilities. I think to your question about can we do it differently? Can we do it better? You know, it's a great question for the superintendent, but I'm going to say we meet the needs of our students based on their IEPs, and those IEPs often dictate what services they need, how many hours of remediation they get or don't get, and then it's a math formula to how many teachers do you need. So I think the answer is no. I think that every superintendent that's been here tries to do that as best they can, whether that goes back to Dick Ayers or Steve Chamberlain and currently Mike Flynn. A lot of that work also gets done by instructional assistants because remediation needs are so high in terms of what students need both in and out of the classroom. So I don't know. I wouldn't want to use Pembroke as a model for what they did. I thought what they did was absolutely reckless.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to suggest that we use them as a model, but just as a working experiment, just to observe.
Yeah. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how they deal with the year. I mean, their class sizes are going to have to go up, I would assume, because there's only so much you can do in special education.
Thank you very much.
Anything here, but I think it's also important to put out on the table that since the 80s, the 70s, the 80s, we're dealing with a lot of different situations. The world has changed. We're dealing with a lot of different situations, health concerns, and the schools, you know, deal with what's going on in society. So I think special ed has changed as the needs have changed, and I think that it has grown. And we have found many more students in need. I'm just making an observation of what I've seen.
I will, you know, one of the things that I learned in doing the DOE 25 data, I also broke it down by school. And it was interesting to see that our costs of salaries at the elementary schools were actually higher, but it's a function of this is a great place to work and people stay. Where we tend to have more turnover in the middle high school. That was my thought on how that would be. But you know, when you think about people that are here, they stay for a long, long time, which benefits our kids and the community. That continuity is important.
I will say that these numbers may not be right. You probably know more than I do because it was years ago that I had to research them for a totally different context. But when you talk about the systems that we have to operate under, when those laws were passed for special education, that was actually a federal law. The federal government guaranteed that they would fund, and I believe the number was 50% at the time.
I remember that.
The highest they ever achieved was 17% ever out of the 50% that they guaranteed. And I think the last time that I looked at the number, which again was years ago, they were currently funding about 13%. So I mean, if you do the math, that's a large deficit that comes back, you know, in our case in New Hampshire, we fund education locally, so it comes back to the local towns. But that is another example of the systems that we operate in that we, you know, are seem well beyond our ability to impact.
And another one like that is the state retirement system.
Yep, sure. And I will say, as far as the Pembroke situation, because I do business in that area, specifically in Chichester, that there's already a movement in Chichester that feeds their kids to PA to pull away from the school. So it's gonna be a mess.
So we don't need to show the workbook, Neil. I think we can do that at our next meeting. I'll pull it together with the data that Krista has developed and some of what Rob has. I just want to share a few things that have struck me. And I mean, for me, I've just been interested in collecting data and then trying to figure out how to be able to chart out, the town's budget and changes in the changes in budget over time relative to different indices. And I haven't done it with the school because we didn't want to make it ask of the school until we figured out how we wanted to approach this. But one of the things that has struck me is just looking at the trends, the recent trends as opposed to longer year trends. So I'll read some numbers out. I'm sorry that I don't have this on a chart yet, but so if you look at the 10-year average PCE is 2.6%. And the 10-year average this is the annual increase. 10-year average in the MCI, Krista, that's municipal cost index, right, is 3.2%. So 2.6 and 3.2, those are some indices. The 10-year average in the town's budget is 6%, about double. And the 10-year average in what the tax rate is hard to look at because it changes it with revaluation every 5 years. So I just looked at the amount raised by taxes, which is really what taxpayers have to pay for. And that 10-year is 6.1%. So, in essence, about twice the indices. Then if you look at the 5-year, the most recent 5 years, PCE 3.8%, municipal cost index 4.6, town budget 7.8. That's all in, by the way, not just the operating budget. And raised by taxes 7.9. So about, again, just say double-ish. And I'm not picking on the town, by the way. I'm just showing, because I've supported every one of those budgets. I've been on the budget committee for the last 8 years. So it's, again, like, I think the town has done a perfectly fine job and the school validating its budgets. But I do think this reflects a growing pressure on income of our town and school expenditures. And then the last 3 years, where we've obviously had some unusual inflationary pressures, PCE average 3 years, surprisingly, 3.8%. MCI, 3.4%. And town budget, 9.3%. Raised by taxes, 10.5%. So the trend, if you look at the trend, it's steepening. And I'm just gonna, I think we're gonna have to wrestle with this. We can validate what the town and the school are going to be able to validate, I think, because they're responsible. They've been doing responsible budgeting. And it's also true that the pressure on income has been growing. The trend has been increasing. We just have to wrestle with those numbers. I'll share it with you in a better format.
I will note that I had a similar takeaway, Mark. Like I haven't been on the budget committee as long. But I mean, I looked at the same numbers and I looked at the indices, and one thing that was heartening is, like, you can obviously see, sort of, at least in the recent years, like, we're on a similar curve, right? It's not like we're out of whack with a general trend. Like, we all know inflation happened, and we had like our increases kind of curved with inflation, more or less. But at the same time, I would say, like, it did strike me as, whether we want to put a target on it or not, officially, as a reasonable, at least on a personal basis, a reasonable position to take, to say, I would not like to see our overall tax rate increase this year come in wildly out of whack with what we expect any of these inflation indices to come in. And so maybe we don't need to say the right number is 2.5% or 3% or 7% or whatever. But I think it is like it is certainly something that I plan to personally look at as a budget committee member to sanity check the indices that we know the households will be facing in terms of inflation in their household, and what the national kind of averages are on the inflationary pressures on municipalities, and then do at least a little bit of a smell test of how this is faring out to sort of guide my own decision making. That is personally where I'm at the moment. Because it doesn't necessarily feel there, we can always say that there are reasons every year why our increases are higher than the indices. And every year there might be good reasons for that, but at some point, if it's a long-term trend, I think it is worth questioning. Is there some more that we could be doing or a closer look we could be taking?
Mark,
That
I
was-
just want. I'm sorry, Krista.
No, I was done. Thank you.
So I just pulled up PCE with the subcomponent for services healthcare and tracked the last 10 years. So it's sort of an interesting, again, I did the percent change from year to year on an annual basis. So if you look at 2019, it was 5.3% for healthcare. If you go back to 2004, it was 7.35. And the graph essentially sort of trends up and down in that range. Then during COVID, as we all know, it dove down to a negative number because nobody went to the doctors. In 2021, apparently we had a bit of a rebound effect. It was up to 11.7%. Maybe that's why our mod was so high. Everybody got stuff done. 2022 is at 5.5%. And in 2023, it was at 8.02%. So again, if we're going to use those indicators, we can't just use the indicator. You have to use the subcomponent of the indicator that applies to the school or the town. So just using PCE to say budget to this, that's not a fair estimation. Can you put the circle graph up there?
Sure.
I mean, think about the things that we don't buy that are up there. We don't buy recreation. We don't buy housing. We don't buy a whole lot of food and beverages. I mean, what we buy that's up there are other goods and services, perhaps, because I'm not sure of what's in those subcomponents. So, but the healthcare one is the one. And so we look at the last 3 years, we've been consistently above 6% since late moving into 2021. So that's, again, that's my concern, that if we're going to validate, let's validate specifically to something that is as equivalent as we can get. And it can't be the whole basket of goods. It just can't be, because that's not what we're buying.
Yeah, and that's not, I agree for validating, and I don't agree for looking at growing pressure on income. I think that's where the PC is actually the right indicator.
Yeah.
So if your budget is growing at a faster rate than the PCE as a whole, you could take the relevant portions of the PCE to say your budget's growing at an appropriate rate, but it's still growing at a faster rate than the overall PCE, which reflects the cost of living for people. So it means you're increasing the pressure on income from that budget relative to the overall inflationary index.
Perhaps.
We've got to
I'm not
control,
going to debate the economist on that. That's my perception.
you've got to do that on a per capita basis though, because the population's up by 7% or so over that same period.
Population of New Hampshire or
The town.
oh, yeah.
That would probably be an argument that I would like to use, but I'm not sure the school would, because the school population has declined.
I'm talking about the other side of the equation, though. He's saying in terms of people's ability to pay, you can't just look at the budget as a fixed number. You've got to look at how many people are burdened with paying for that, right? So yes, at the same time, you could scrutinize the school budget and say the school population has declined over that same period, which is on the other side of the scale.
Our enrollment numbers have been pretty stable, actually. Just to be clear.
I guess I'm not sure what we're trying to get out of tonight. It seems like the general consensus is some kind of an inflation index is a goal. But whether it's the school or the town, if we can't achieve it, there's going to be distinct reasons. I mean, on the town side, as you know, it's going to be roads. And, you know, should we spend money on roads, or should we go back to the situation from years ago and neglect the roads in order to hold a lower rate? That's not going to be decided tonight. And it won't be decided until we end up presenting something 6 months from now.
I guess I feel like the purpose of this conversation originally was, there were members of the budget committee who were curious about, do we want to set a target rate or a cap, a budget increase cap based on tied to some inflationary index? That was a question that was posed at our last budget committee meeting. And I don't know if there's any interest in doing that. I think the conversation for me tonight is now more about clarifying what are the questions that we're curious about asking and answering during the course of the budget process. I think we've articulated two different ones that are they're related, but they're different. And then what are some appropriate indices that we can use to help evaluate the budget proposals against each of those questions? And I think we've identified, we need to like get them written down and, chart them out. But I think I feel like I've come away with some better information that I came in with about what some of those indices might be.
I mean, one thing we could do is we could choose at this meeting not to set a target or provide explicit guidance if we don't feel that we'll be ready, but we could state that as part of our evaluation process this year, we will look at the town and school budget and combined impact against one or a couple of these indices. So we could just take like last year, that would even be, to my mind, like a step better than we did last year, where or at least while I've been on the committee, we have not explicitly looked at, okay, this implies a tax rate increase, or the school operating budget increased by X%. How does that weigh against these indices? The town is increasing against this. How does that weigh against the municipal cost index? What is the combined tax rate? In that way, the town and the school would know that the budget committee intends to do that without us putting an explicit target number in place.
I don't have any problem with that approach.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I think this is about having good conversations about inflation, perhaps educating folks away from certain comments about it or concepts about inflation and how it pertains to the town. The more we have those discussions, I think they're great questions to ask people, not only when we're building our budgets and, thinking about what we need to do. So long as whatever index, or I would say sub-index, is most appropriate to judge against, whether it,
I don't know, Rob, if we're going to have I at least haven't heard that there's exactly strict consensus on that tonight. Like, I don't know that needs to be, I don't know that we all need to totally shake hands and say, like, this is the index to rule them all. Like, we can just Like, we can look at PCE and CPI and MCI, and we all have our opinions on whether they're relevant or not. Like, I guess I'm wary to like, at least I have not heard exact consensus tonight on the school side that there's a perfect index to consider. Maybe I missed it 'cause I'm remote.
I'm coming away, this is a very complex issue. This is the first time we've had the numbers and we've even tried to even understand it. And I thank you that we have an economist helping us through this, and Mark, you obviously got a lot. Charlie, you're coming in, I'm sure too. But I think I think this is gonna be good. I think we gotta boil this down a little bit more to find out what areas are relevant to us trying to decide what a budget should come to. Boil some of that down so that we can articulate it back to the audience who's going to come in and say, hey, look, my social security only went up this much. How can you possibly raise, my budget this much? And we would have some kind of information to pass back that yes, that's a relevant question and it's a relevant benchmark, but these are the other factors that come into why the budget is going in the direction it is and how it relates to whatever our numbers are and your individual numbers are. I think we've got to be able to come out of this with being able to educate all of us as taxpayers in the town. I mean, we're sitting here listening to this, which most people, 99% will never have the opportunity to do unless they're in the business of that. So I think we just need to boil it down a little bit more and come up with, some kind of rationalization as we move forward. It's going to be a continuum. It's not going to be just one answer. And I'm just happy to see the various different pieces that go into this. And the fact that, I'm going to rely on you folks are in the subcommittee to identify which pieces relate better than the other pieces and boil that down maybe for the next meeting and come up with some kind of rationalization of how we define and explain this further.
I agree. It's been a really good discussion tonight. I also would like to say that a couple of the other things that were mentioned that I'd like as part of all this discussion, I know it will be. My observation is that people have also asked, what am I going to lose? We come up with an index, we have why we came up with that number, and then what kinds of services or what will happen? What's the impact of what we've come? And I just think all this is part of that discussion.
I'd just like to ask for the next meeting, if you could find the information, is the rising of the population of Hopkinton in itself causing inflation in the cost of services? Would a 3% rise in population slow our school and town expenditures versus the 7% that we've been experiencing?
Or would it increase it?
Right. Oh yeah, to the reverse, sure. Is it because the reason this question is relevant is because there is a push at the state level to have towns have more houses built. And there's a movement within our community to change zoning, potentially change zoning and explode the number of certain classes of housing in our town. And maybe if that's what's causing inflation, maybe we should not move in the direction of building more houses. That's all.
Then I propose that we've had a really, really good discussion.
Can I
that
say
this is
something,
to-
Debbie?
Yes, of course.
I just feel the specific indicators that we decide to look at over the process, whichever they are, will be interesting for the folks who follow our process. And I think that goes to what Dawn was just saying, that we need to be able to explain why we're doing this. And the original conceit of this conversation was based on why is the budget committee, what role do we play? And we've been told that we've got to find the balance that is sustainable for the town. And the boards are not our constituents, the town is our constituent. So how are we supposed to be fair to people who are absent? We've got the people who are present, presenting our reasonable budgets. But the people who aren't here are the people who we're supposed to be trying to find a sustainable point for whom we're supposed to be finding a point of sustainable affordability. And I don't know if there's a difference between ability to pay and affordability. I think that might be semantics. But we can't operate in a vacuum where just one budget to the next makes rational sense. I understand that it does, and we're adults and we understand that there's variables that change year over year. But if we all sit around reading these with no idea of what is sustainable and what is not, then we're not doing our job. Reading it and justifying it is good, but I think Krista's right. I think we need to add a step. And the step is, as a group, do we feel comfortable with this % increase? Kind of regardless of what it means, whether or not we do or not. Like, that goes back to our prior conversation. It can't be, what are we going to lose? It has to be, is this sustainable? Because it's both, it's complicated, and we are not supposed to dig into those specifics. We've been told. So it has to be, what is sustainable? It's what Catherine said, and that is what the municipal association documents say is our charge. And it's technically the budget committee's budget, right? We vote on a town meeting, the budget committee's budget. So I think it's a relevant conversation to keep going, but also eventually we have to settle on some concrete number that will always be debatable. But if we don't, then we have only the years to look backwards toward, which isn't helpful because new kids move to town that need new services or something like that. So if we have to look forward because there are variables, then there has to be something to look to compare it against in order to find that magical sustainability that we're supposed to be finding as a board.
Lots of good conversations, not going to be decided tonight. We're going to move this as we go forward and put it on our agendas and continue the discussion. And I want to thank everybody, especially those that brought their information to add to the conversation tonight. Any further discussion before we?
Could I just ask it that this, Rob's presentation and whatever presentation you come back with, and Krista come back with be in paper? Not in computer. Thank you.
Actually send it to Neil in advance next time.
It would be really helpful
Some
if like by
printouts.
Monday.
Yeah.
We could have things.
Right.
Especially if you're at the point where the publish more involved, because I do get calls saying, why isn't this?
I can concentrate so much more when it's on paper.
That is fair, and I will apologize, at least on my part. I did intend to have that, and then I had unexpected travel this month that derailed my best of intentions.
Well, thank you both. Anyway, we know you will.
Anyone that wants paper, they just let me know on Monday. We'll make sure that we have it for the meeting for you.
You want it?
And so let me know.
The old birds want it in paper.
You need things in Excel, not Google Sheets. That-
Or PDFs are actually the best if you can convert them to PDFs, because everybody can kind of open those no matter what format they're using. Or if you send them to my Google, then I can convert them to.
All right, we have Krista on there, but do we have anyone else
You do
from the
not.
public? All right, so we won't have any public comment this evening. Any other business to come before the board tonight? before we
Just the next
close?
meeting.
We need to make our next. Meeting. All right, let's look at when we would like to meet. This is May, and I think last year, did we wait after our May meeting and meet in September? Or do we want to continue this discussion and have another meeting in June? Thoughts?
You know, I'm not, I feel fine about waiting until September personally. And what I want to try to come to the next meeting with, and, you know, we'll really try to work with Rob and Krista on this, is at the very least, just, you know, here are 5 indices and what we think their potential value may be as we consider budgets. And we don't all have to agree on the importance of each of those indices or whether they're the ones that, you know, as individual. I think, Vicky, just like your comments were helpful for me. Like, I don't know that we'll all agree on, at the end of the day, we're going to vote on the budgets. And so that's, you know, at that point, we're going to be saying what each of us think, whether each of us thinks the budget is appropriate, sustainable, however you want to describe it. But I do think we could come to that with, here are, you know, half a dozen indices and or sub indices and what we think they might tell us as we evaluate the school and the town budgets in whole and individual pieces of them. And to me, having those by September works because we're not gonna have any budget information by then anyway.
When does HEA negotiation take place?
It will begin soon and it should be concluded by December at the latest, hopefully well before that. I will be zooming in September, by the way. I will not be in New England. I will be somewhere in, I don't know, the Pacific Northwest in my van. So I'll see you guys in October. But I will zoom in.
Fine with September too, but Mark, I'd ask maybe if, as soon as you do have the information, if you could just share it.
It'll be at least 3 days before the September meeting. We'll try to build some momentum off of that.
Krista, do you have any comments about setting the meeting as chair?
I will, I think that I am available for August or September or October. So I don't, I would defer to the committee's availability.
So I think so far we have basically September on the table. Would everyone agree? A further discussion? We'll go with September, which would make it
September 11th.
September. Thank you, Neil. September 11th then?
I don't like 9/11.
Oh,
All day.
yes, it is. Yes, okay. All right, so if we're all okay with that, we'll do September 11th then. And look forward to the information, Mark, Rob, that you can send our way. Great discussion. I want to thank everyone for being here tonight. Krista from San Francisco, enjoy. And,
Thank you, Debbie. Really nicely done.
Thank you. All right, then. So I would motion to adjourn. Thank you, Steve. All right, so made, seconded. All in favor?
Hi.
Aye.
Thank you.